Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Progressive Radio Network, Pacifica Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and more. The complete archives are available at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show is Chris Vogler, and I'm really excited to have Chris back. It's been 11 years since he was last on the show. He is a screenwriter, a story analyst, an actor, a consultant, including working on Disney's movie, The Lion King, and he's the author of the best-selling book, The Writer's Journey, a practical approach to using mythic ideas, particularly Joseph Campbell's ideas about the hero's journey and Carl Jung's ideas about archetypes. And the book is about to be released in its 25th anniversary edition. And I have to say, well, first, great to have you back, Chris.
Very nice to be here after 11 years. I'm glad to catch up with you again.
Yeah. Your book really had a big influence on me and my life.
Huh.
It really inspired me in huge ways. I had just come to the realization, and I think your book played a big part in it, that there's a science to story. And your book takes us on the journey of how to understand that science of story, and what makes stories work to make them more powerful. And what you've done with this 25th anniversary edition is really cool. You've added so many new ideas and ways of thinking about story and the human condition, really. It's just remarkable. So, you know, it's hard to imagine fitting everything I want to get out of this conversation into 1 hour, but we're going to see what we can do, and then we'll take it from there. So I think the first thing we need to do is get some basics down. In a couple minutes, which is not a simple thing because you've got hundreds of pages in doing it, what are the basic concepts of the hero's journey and the archetypes associated with it?
Well, the basic idea is derived, as most people know by now, from the work of Joseph Campbell, who, of course, was a great pioneer in our understanding of the deep connections between story and psychology. And also weaving that together with the patterns that he found in mythology. And the essence of the idea is a metaphor. It's a way of looking at stories through a particular lens, that of the journey, which is automatically something we think about as a story. Every journey seems to tell its own tale, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's a natural metaphor for us. And even though some stories don't involve actual physical travel somewhere, there's always going to be this sense of a journey. And the idea is that typically I use 12 stations to get through this cycle. Campbell was a little more elaborate and went a little deeper psychologically, perhaps, but he had about 16 points. But the basic idea is that we all begin somewhere in some kind of structure or collective unit with a family, with a society. And then at some point in our psychological development or in the ups and downs of life, we're kind of cast out or we voluntarily separate ourselves, and then we go on our journey. And in that journey, we encounter different kinds of energies, different beings, different people, different structures, and those all impinge on us as the heroes of our own stories. And yes.
No, I the two things I left out that I wanted to include. One is Campbell wrote the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and titled it by that because he believed that every culture has a hero's journey myth in it. And so what makes this so powerful is that every culture, it's a part of being human. You've been raised with that idea of the hero's journey as a part of your culture and a part of the mythology that you were raised with. And I think that's a really important part to think about this with, because you already have that hero's journey story embedded in your, almost maybe literally in your DNA, in the way your brain thinks and the way you perceive. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. In fact, this is one of the things I've encountered in recent years. there is a movement to make scientific some of this study, which has been up till now literary, perhaps a little psychological, a little bit pop and media oriented. But there is now a movement among anthropologists, basically, to study heroism as a thing. And the idea of heroism that is, as you say, embedded in all of us, these scientists are saying it's actually exactly what you said. It is embedded in the DNA structure. They trace the beginnings of this pattern of struggle and change all the way back to the cellular level, and say that from the very beginnings of life, there is this heroic challenge and striving and growth and cycles of birth and rebirth. So this is something, I've always said is deep, but it just keeps getting deeper.
And your book helped inspire me to start a conference, StoryCon, the summit meeting on the art, science, and application of story, that I ran for 6 years, bringing together all the different worlds of story. And from what I understand, it was the first time anybody did that. There were conferences on screenwriting and novel writing and marketing, but I brought all the people together, including neuroscientists and mythologists and ministers and lawyers and marketers. And it's because I really believe that there is a science to story. And I really believe that it was pre-human Neanderthals or Australopithecus sitting around a fire telling about the day's hunt that was storytelling that led to the evolution of the brain that we have now. And so the other question, before you get into the details of what happens in the hero's journey, is who do you think can benefit from learning about the hero's journey? I know the book is aimed towards creative people and writers, but I really think, and so I'm going to just say it, I think that every person listening to this can get a lot out of reading this book and understanding the hero's journey, because every one of us, every time we go through change, we go through a hero's journey.
Yes, you find this, I think, that you approach the book from the point of view of, I want to write a script or something like that, but people quickly find this is really talking about me and my life, and it's describing things that maybe have already happened or are about to happen, and helps to give people orientation. And from the very beginning of exposing these ideas to the public, I found feedback that said, it's okay, it's fine as a screenwriting technique. It works very well for that, or for writing novels. The romance novelists, for instance, came to me immediately and said, this is great for structuring our kind of stories. But at the same time, people were coming up in tears saying, oh, this is really about me and my experience in Vietnam, or this is about me as a single mother. This is about me as someone trying to start up a business. I found all up and down the line, travel agents were coming to me and saying, this describes travel. One came to me and said she worked with Arctic scientists on planning travel trips that were part research and part entertainment for them, but she gave them my hero's journey outline, which has these 12 stages. And they came back and reported, oh my goodness, everything predicted there did happen to us. We had all the ups and downs, but also we noticed that it was describing what we do as scientists when we take an idea and shake it by the throat and try to test a hypothesis to its extremes. All of that pattern was repeated. So what is described in that book and what Campbell was talking about does work in the world of stories, but it seems to work in all these other universes as well.
So I just want to add that Campbell's book is brilliant. It's definitely worth a read, but what you've done is you've made it a lot more accessible and easier to read. Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is an academic tome that is loaded with references and really obscure references to all kinds of mythological stuff that's very interesting. but it's like it's like butter reading yours. And it's like, it's in your final chapter, you talk about this journey you took where you had to climb in these mountains where you felt your life was at risk. And it's so much easier reading yours, and the clarity and integrating it with Jung's ideas about archetypes is just beautiful. And where it took me was, I gave talks at national conferences to psychologists on how going into therapy is a hero's journey, about how discovering that you have cancer or deciding you want to get help for something is a heroic journey as well. So when I say this is a book that every person listening to this could benefit from, I'm dead serious. This is a masterpiece of a book. It really is.
Well, thank you. And I'll forever be humble in the shadow of Mr. Campbell, who in his poetic way really took a deep dive into these things. And I was just lucky, you know, as a student of film, as a young person in film school, I was looking for the unwritten rules. I knew there had to be some kind of a philosophy or a theory of storytelling, and couldn't find it at that time, because this was early days in the 70s when there weren't that many screenwriting books written yet. So when I found Campbell's work, I just had the lights turned on, and suddenly everything I was looking for was there. And it was not easy to get at it through all of the poetry and the myriad examples that he gives. But I had that time as a graduate student, and I dedicated myself to uncorking all of this stuff and then giving it back to people in a little bit simplified way. And it's funny to me, because Campbell himself was put down by the academic community because he was thought of as an oversimplifier, and that he was dumbing down the ideas, or taking them out of the academic realm and trying to give them to people generally.
Well, he also did a series of talks with Bill Moyers,
Yes.
which was popular, which massively popularized the idea as well. So he did popularize, and he did take a popular approach to it. The other thing I want to say about this book is you didn't just look at Jung, and you didn't just look at Campbell. You looked at a number of other really key sources for looking at story. You know, me getting involved in this story conference, I did a lot of research on it. So you looked at the Russian researcher of fairy tales, Prokop and Egri. I mean, you have the level of research that you've done, that you put into this book, is just extraordinary. And it just shows how deeply you've gone over the last 25 years with it.
Thank you, Rob. You know, this was part of just the way I approach things. When I worked at Disney, for instance, I ended up being kind of a general researcher for them. And it was that ability to sort of cherry pick and pull out things quickly out of a big, massive information that served me well in that Disney job, and also in putting this book together. Because, no one system, in even Campbell's, as exhaustive and thorough as it is, no one system completely covers this huge subject, and also all the things you need to know as a storyteller, a screenwriter, or as a human being. So I needed to supplement the Campbell information with some other sources, and among them was vaudeville. The whole tradition of vaudeville was a huge informing thing for me that helped to flesh out the theory. And the interesting thing is, all of these other things, even such a thing as the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous, which has a 12-step design to it, to its philosophy, it didn't attack my ideas. They all supported each other. And it was a very interesting thing to weave all this stuff together.
Okay, so let's get back now. Tell us, what are the 12 stations of the hero's journey?
Well, first you have an ordinary world that establishes the basic conditions of the hero, the past of the hero, the environment that he or she, or if it's a collective, what everybody is living through. And then secondly, there is a call to adventure that seems to be essential for getting people to understand there's a story being told here. So something is needed or wanted, and the audience needs to understand that so that they can get on board. So then the next inevitable sort of event is that the third thing is the refusal of the call, because it's very normal and human for people confronted with the possibility of change to say, no, 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 not for me, or not just now, or I've already done that and I didn't like it. I'm not that kind of guy. You know, we hear all these phrases.
Is there a story that you use to illustrate it when you're teaching it?
Well, yes. I mean, it's very easy to see it in something like Star Wars. I mean, that was a huge event for me, because I was in the midst of studying Campbell when the first Star Wars movie came out, and I went to see it at the Fox lot on the invitation of George Lucas, who invited the whole film school of USC to come down and see it. And it just bore out point by point everything I had just sucked out of Campbell. There it was, put right to work on the screen. So
and Lucas literally hung out with Campbell in creating the movie.
Yeah, I suspected that in the beginning. I think he didn't catch up to Campbell until later in one of the sequels, but they did become allies and very closely worked together. And so Joe was a true mentor to him. And that's actually the next stage. If we relate all this to Star Wars, the first stage is, here's Luke Skywalker on his sort of dusty outback planet, and he's bored. And he wants badly to go to the stars and find himself. So there's his desire. There's refusal of the call. The call is, Obi-Wan Kenobi, we need your help. And
rescue Princess Leia.
To rescue the princess. So there's an external goal as well as his internal desire to see the stars. The refusal of the call is his own reluctance to accept the gift of the mentor, to realize that he's the destined one. So he puts it off for a while and says, I can't really go. I've got a lot of homework to do and I have responsibilities on the farm, so maybe it's not for me. And at that point, the mentor comes on stage. That's the fourth of my 12 stages. Some kind of force, maybe it's a character, maybe it's something internal, that represents wisdom and higher level guidance. And that's, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi, giving him this gift, which is an important part of the mentor's job, of his father's sword, which is a great symbol from past mythology that usually means something to do with the failures of the past generation and the hopes of the new generation. So he is encouraged, as heroes are, by that mentor. Now he's ready to overcome the fear of the refusal of the call. And that leads to the stage 5, which is crossing the threshold. We're now prepared, maybe with a gift from the mentor. You're ready to really dig in and begin the adventure. And this is a thing, a feeling that you find in movies. You just know as a movie watcher, all the prep is now done. The airplane is ready to take off. And the story's really going to get rolling.
And I just want to throw in, you know, yeah. and if it's not about a movie and it's about your life,
yes.
it may be that some event happens to you, like you get a really bad headache, worse than the ones you've had before, and you finally say to yourself, I'm gonna get some help, even though your family has said you've had headaches all your life, you're never going to get rid of them. And you finally decide, yeah, I'm going to call the doctor and I'm going to make that appointment. It's that simple in terms of the hero's journey in your life.
Yes, you know, we have the phrase, the last straw. And sometimes that's what operates here, is that things have built up within you. You have hesitated, you have considered, but then the one more thing happens, one more penny on the scale, and suddenly it tips, and now you're ready to really take on change with all the unknowns and fears that go with that. So in movies, this stage 5 is a real sort of curtain coming down on the first act and the beginning of the second act. a long period of time in which we'll explore these new things. So this is in movies celebrated by music that tells you we're moving to the new world. Sometimes they'll use physical architecture, going through archways, going down hallways, going up steps, jumping over a chasm, going over a bridge. All these things are symbols of leaving the ordinary world that you know and going into this unknown special world.
I love it. In an interview, you described how often the music involves using brass.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You'll hear that earlier at the Call to Adventure. They will often reach for that part of the orchestra, get out those metallic sounds that have associations for us of calling you to war, calling you to the hunt, calling you to face your fate. And then the music sometimes has an exotic quality to it at this stage 5 because we're going to an exotic unknown place. So next thing up, 6, is what happens when you crash land in this special world. You've made the leap of faith. Now you've landed in the new world and you have to sort of get oriented. So this is a period of orientation to the rules of the new world, which are different. So the currency might be different. The language might be different. The value systems might be different. So you have to begin to explore all that. And it's a little like pop quizzes in a college class where you are given little tests. And I call this stage tests, allies, and enemies because you are tested in small ways. You make some allies typically, and you might find some beginnings of an enemy type relationship.
And you know, this is the bottom up show. I call it the bottom up show. And my last interview with you, we talked about how there could be a bottom up hero. And we spent a whole session talking about that. But what I discovered, and actually my son helped me figure it out because I told all my kids about the hero's journey because I thought it was be an important thing for them to know just in living life.
Yeah.
And he said, really, this, what you just described, that making allies and finding new skills and resources and on the road, that's about as bottom up as you can get. You go out into the world and you reconnect in new ways and make new connections. That's bottom up.
And it is like that, as I found when I traveled outside the United States for the first times. When my book came out, I was immediately invited to speak in Europe about these things. It was all new. And I found that going to Spain, that was the first place I went, everything was different. And it had to be worked out on this very base human level, out on the street, in the little apartment I was staying in, working out things like the light switches operate on a completely different theory than my light switches in the United States. And of course, the language and everything else was different as well. So heroes go through a period of adjustment as they get to know their way around. And it's not usually a fatal moment. It can be dangerous, but it's like a quiz in a college class that it points out to you, you're a little weak in this area, you're strong over here, you might need some allies to help you where you're weak, you're gonna have trouble because enemies will attack you where you're weak. So, gather all your weapons and equipment and prepare yourself for the bigger things that are yet to come. So next thing up is a period of time in a story where we've pivoted from dealing with the old world. Now we're facing forward and moving into that special world, but we're not to the center yet. And the center is where all the power is. So there's a period of time after you enter the door and then walk sort of, often literally, towards that central power. And on that part of the journey, walking to the central place, there will often be a period of going a little deeper and studying the others. And I just call this generally the approach phase. You've made a team, you've made some enemies, and you begin to see other dimensions of these fellow travelers and also of yourself, because you went into all of this with a set of conceptions about yourself, and those are all going to be shaken up and changed. So this is a period of time where you re-see yourself and the other people around you. And you might have made snap judgments about them and yourself. Now you begin to revise those as we spend time. As an audience, you spend time with the characters and you get to know them better. And this is where sometimes you build character through humor, through romance, through suspense. So these are periods of developing relationships and exploring tensions a little more.
And I just want to point out that if you're thinking about this in your personal life, this is where you're going through the process of becoming a new person, really. You're being reborn. And, I wanted to mention that refusal stage. The refusal stage, when it's your personal life, is where you decide, I'm not going to change. I'm going to stay the way I am. I'm going to cut off that door to me having a new potential, a new way of life. And so because I want to try to keep people thinking about how this applies just to anybody in their life. So we need to take a little brief break now for show ID.
Okay.
And my guest for the show is Chris Vogler. He's a screenwriter, story analyst, actor, consultant, including working on Disney's movie The Lion King. And he's the author of the best-selling book, The Writer's Journey, which is going into its 25th year edition. And you've been telling us about the different stations or stages of the hero's journey. So continue.
Yes, well, we were at stage 7, which I call the approach. And this is the lead up to the big event, which is central in the story. And that's stage 8. And stage 8, I call the ordeal. Campbell called it the supreme ordeal, which I found was a little confusing to people because they thought that meant the biggest event and the climax. It's the big event of the second act, but not the biggest event in the whole story. But it does have some very powerful properties. The ordeal is a kind of a life and death test, and it frequently takes the pattern of death and rebirth. So it is a very, very deep ancient pattern that goes back to the shamanic days when people did dances and ceremonies to act out their relationships and explore their relationships with the greater powers around them. And part of those ceremonies was often a fake death. They would sort of put the audience into a trance and then allow them to witness the staged death of a god or a character, and then mourn that for a period of time, feel bereft, feel upset by this loss, and then turn it so that that character, that being, comes back to life.
And I just want to mention, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed John Perkins. He's famous for his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, but he's really, for the last 30 or 40 years, he got into living and working in Central and South America, working with shamans. And his newest book is Touching the Jaguar. And what he describes as an experience that he had, one of his earliest experiences was on a guided ayahuasca journey with a shaman, was him touching a jaguar. And he basically said that you're afraid to do it. But then the jaguar invites you. And when you finally do, you wake up to something different and new. I mean, it's just that's totally different culture, different mythology in some ways, but also the same.
Yes, well, you find so many resonances of that and so many expressions of this in the ancient world and in all cultures. This seems to be one of those basic building blocks of story and religion. So many religions revolve around the idea of a god who dies or a character who dies and then somehow is reborn. Or like Orpheus goes into the underworld, does some mission there, and then returns to the world of the living, but always is transformed. And that's the essence of this idea, as I understand it from Mr. Campbell, is that these are all metaphors. All the stories and myths and creations of this type are metaphors for the natural stages of progression in someone's life and the transformations that must take place, or else we begin to stagnate and die. Just as a little personal thing, yesterday I was out for a walk on a nature trail, and I came across a 4.5-foot long snake skin on the trail. The snake had just shed his skin, and I didn't see him slither away, but I was the first person to come across this. And the snake skin was a powerful symbol to me of how you are constrained in your life. And then an event like this comes along, and you sort of split out of the old shell of your life so that you can grow and go on. And it's not easy for the snake to do that. I could see from the evidence on the trail that the snake had really struggled. He had threaded his way through some branches cleverly so that the branches would hold on to the skin, and he was able to slip out of it that way.
Nice. So, very nice.
Isn't it nice that sometimes the obstacles become your allies? You know, he might have felt horribly stuck for a moment, but then might have realized, oh, if I keep going this way, it's going to catch the skin and I'll be able to slip away.
Well, you do talk about that in your book, that obstacles that first appear to be blocking and impeding the character end up being what helps the character to become the new person.
Yeah, now, interestingly, just now, as you said that, I had a physiological reaction in my body, in my spine. I just experienced a typical thing, which is a shiver that sort of runs down the spine. And I've learned that this is my body reacting to something true or beautiful that's just been seen or heard or expressed. So you just said something true, and it made me feel something in my body. And this is really what I am always interested in and striving for, to maybe wake people up a little bit to how they watch a movie or how they experience what goes on in their lives. And sometimes a coincidence or an image will occur to them, and they'll feel something. They'll feel shiver down the arm or shiver down the back. A beautiful piece of music in the climax often can trigger this. So I'm always on the hunt for those things.
Well, you know, I got really interested in that. One of the things that I got interested in before I got interested in story was positive psychology. And what got me into it was understanding the heartwarming experience.
Oh.
And what I learned was there was a study that looked at what gave people the chill up the back of the neck. And in an early conversation with you, you described that as a frisson.
Uh-huh. Yes, the French have that word, yeah.
And it ended up, so the guy did a study on it. And he looked at it, and it got really huge press because people who had their heart touched were more likely to have it than it being involved in sex.
Yes, yes.
So it's really powerful.
Yes, you know, and I love the marriage of the philosophy and the science. It's wonderful how they come together.
And the science includes that it's mediated by endorphins.
Yes.
The natural opiates that our bodies produce. So when you tell a great story or come up with a great idea that touches somebody, you're stimulating their natural production of opiates or endorphins.
Yeah. And it is, so you have this onboard chemistry set that is activated by images, and people in stress situations, when you see them or hear about them or read about them, that's enough to trigger these things. Someone did a study of the singer Adele, who is known for causing people to cry. Her songs cause people to burst into tears, almost comically. And they've zeroed in on a specific vocal trick that she does. That's called an appoggiatura, which is a little tremolo in her voice. She'll sing, ah, and it'll go up and down like that very rapidly. And that seems to be a trigger because it's emotional. It's the sort of sound you make when you're intensely upset about something or feeling something deeply, and then it causes that reaction chemically and emotionally in people's minds.
Okay, so I want to get through the rest of the list, though. Then we can, because there's so much more I want to talk about, because your book goes into so much depth in so many areas. So we were at 8.
Yeah. So we're at 8, which is the sort of centerpiece of the whole thing. And so we usually find some way in a story or in the experiences of our lives, we feel, you have this feeling, I'm gonna die. That could be literally in a car accident or something, or it could be that I'm gonna fail. So it's a metaphoric death. I'm gonna lose all my money in the stock market. I'm going to fail in a romance or something like that. We need to really, truly feel that failure or death as an audience, and then bring the hero back to life because they stuck it out. They fought back. They didn't give up. They drew on some inner source. And that leads to the next stage, 9, which is the reward for having faced your fears. I mean, because that's the essence of stage 8, is facing your greatest fear of death or failure, or physical danger, something like that. So if you do that, you are rewarded, and that's sort of guaranteed by the system, that there is a gain for every venture where you go near to the edge of death or failure. When you confront those fears, you get something back in return. And I say something much larger than the investment you put into it. It really pays interest on your investment. So that stage reward is sometimes a physical celebration that, oh, we survived, hooray. Or if you killed a dragon, maybe you saw off some of the dragon leg and you make a barbecue and you feed yourself. Or in a more subtle way, you simply look inside and you evaluate what just happened. I went through death. I came as close to death, or I faced my fears as possible. Wow, I feel different now. Something changed. And so there's a moment of reflection, and you often find in scripts a longish speech at this point where the hero looks inside, or maybe even looks into a mirror. That's a very common technique people intuitively go to as directors and writers. Somebody has a good look in the mirror at this point and says, I'm not going to go on as I have in the past. I'm going to go on a different path now. And another thing that has come up in the last few years is just the observation that many times at this point in a story, there will be an open flame. There will be campfires. I call this generically a campfire type scene because it's very common in Westerns. After the big stampede or the shootout, the cowboys sit around a fire and they sort of reflect on what happened. But the presence of an open flame seems to symbolize something. And I don't think people, as filmmakers, are doing this so consciously. It's an unconscious reaching for what feels right. And what feels right here is illumination. So there will be lighting of cigarettes after a love scene. There will be lighting of candles, or there's a fire going somewhere in the scene. It's very common. If you graphed 100 Hollywood movies, you'd find 75 or 80 of them have an open flame. So, or a mirror, something that reflects or causes a little bit of this.
And by the way, if you haven't heard of the hero's journey and you're learning it now, you will never watch a movie the same again. You're going to look for these patterns.
Yeah, it sort of ruins movie going for those people around you for a while because you're shouting out all the time, oh, there's stage 7, and I'm like that in sitting in a theater with someone. I'm looking at my watch going, they're behind a schedule, or they have gone too long without moving on to the next stage. I'm very sensitive to those things. So that's stage 9, the reward. Then there is another kind of pivoting that is necessary, which is to start thinking about going home and closing this circle. So you've gone deep into the special world. You have faced your fears. You took something away with you, some treasure or reward, some better self-understanding. And now it's time to turn towards home. And the characteristic energy here is of acceleration, that we have to speed up to get home again. There's an urgency about it. And so movies will often have chase scenes at this point. Now, a chase can occur anywhere in a structure. You can start with a chase. You can have a chase in Act One. But if you looked at 100 Hollywood movies, 75 or 80 of them have a chase at the end of the second act, about 3/4 of the way through the design. And this is partly to wake the audience up. They've been through some ups and downs and they're sort of aesthetically exhausted. So you have to do something energetic to revive their interest and get the story rolling again and have this sense of acceleration. So chase scenes are common at this point. Or just the sense of somebody after something. One little side note of this is that there's almost a kind of an alphabet of operations that can take place in a story. And they're very, very simple things like escape, rescue, chase, imprisonment, freedom, simple building blocks like that. And here, the chase might be triggered by someone, the bad guy has escaped, we caught him, but he got away again. Or we rescued the princess, but then she's kidnapped again. Or we went and got the treasure, but the bad guy stole it, so we have to chase them. Or we're almost free, but the bad guys are after us, so we have to run, and we're the ones pursued. But somehow this energy seems to assert itself again and again in a way that I find kind of uncanny, but it's very consistent. So next thing up, we have two elements left in the great design, and the stage 11 is what I group together under the term resurrection. And here you have a restaging of this death and rebirth event of stage 8, but here it's elevated and magnified, and the stage 8 thing is typically only in one dimension of your person. It might be a physical challenge, it might be an emotional challenge, it might be a spiritual challenge, but in the stage 11, it's everything. It's spiritual, it's emotional, it's physical, it's social. Everything is on the line. And for one decision or one showdown or one battle, everything is at stake. And here you have courtroom scenes of judgment. You have tournaments and jousts and gunfights and big family arguments. These are occasions for staging the biggest event, the biggest conflict of the whole design. And it should have the property of purifying the hero of all the illusions of the past. This is a way of getting past all of your baloney and standing up for your truth once and for all. And so it's often a harrowing moment where there's a lot of risk. You could fail all over again, and tragic heroes do fail at this point.
And this is also a confluence where some of the new resources and allies also come into play, right?
Yes, what actually most typically happens, I mean, one simple version is in the Star Wars saga, in the first movie, where your ally, Han Solo, has disappeared for a while. He's off stage because he said, this is a little over my head. That's not the kind of thing, I don't go around rescuing entire planets. I'm out for myself. So he's off the screen, but then he shows up again and reintegrates with the hero and joins in.
As does Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, Obi-Wan, even though he's disembodied and theoretically dead, he shows up as a voice that encourages Luke with those magic words, trust the Force. And a little more subtle version of this is that everything the hero has learned from every character, good and bad, enemies and allies, all of that is incorporated. It's been taken in by an astute, alert, awake hero. And so they now can manifest all those things. And you see a beautiful, simple example of this in the work of John Ford in some of his Westerns like Fort Apache. He's talking about the passing of the torch from one generation to the next, or from one stage of American cultural development to the next. And in Fort Apache, he's set up a conflict between Henry Fonda, who plays a by-the-book West Point tough officer and kind of a jerk, and John Wayne, who's a more human guy, more man of the people and so forth. And at the end of the movie, Henry Fonda has been killed like Custer in a badly fought battle. And John Wayne takes over, but John Wayne takes on all of the characteristics, the costume, the mustache, everything to look like Henry Fonda, because he didn't reject Fonda's rules. He took the best parts of them and said, we'll get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, the racism and the overdependence on the rules and so forth, but we'll retain some of the good stuff from this guy. So this is what you find.
You know, we had that conversation in 2011 about how I wanted to see the idea of a bottom-up hero, and we talked about the idea of a collective hero, like a community. Mm-hmm. But really what you just described is how the mythic hero becomes the hero by taking on the wisdom and the knowledge and the courage and the ideas of all the people who he's touched by. And that's incredibly bottom up too. So to become a hero, you have to integrate all the people around you who have touched you.
That's
I love that.
Yeah, it's true. And this, I think, in my speculations, I try to cast my mind back to the beginnings. That's sort of an operating principle of mine. And I think back to the beginnings of the first stories, and I think they were generated in the way you've just described. It starts with deciding who's the hero. Is it a young or old person? Is it a male or a female? They set certain settings in the beginning, and then all the other characters are, I think, generated by the storyteller in response to that first choice. So there's from the bottom, from the hero on up, you get the hero's mentor, the hero's enemy, the hero's love interest, the hero's horse, the hero's friend, and so forth. And then those all are expressed outwardly around the hero, and they batter the hero, and they challenge the hero, and they help the hero. And then the hero scoops them all back up again at the end in this climax at stage 11. And we get to see, did the hero learn his lesson, her lesson, their lesson, or not? And it's a test. It's a final exam, which, you can fail, and that's the tragic case. But in most of our Western stories, we go for the happy ending. And so there'll be a dark moment where it looks like they didn't get it, but then they bounce back and we see, oh yeah, he or she or they did learn the lesson and incorporate all this stuff.
And I will give you credit and mention that in a lot of the book, your hero is a she, not a he.
Well, I grew up being sort of flagellated by my classmates in college. My female classmates just beat me up one side and down the other, deservedly, because I came with the whole package of male superiority assumptions. And though I thought of myself as a feminist, I was revealing in my language and my word choices that I had these embedded ideas. So when I wrote the book, I was attentive to that. And I really tried to create almost a challenge to the assumption that when we say hero, we mean a man. When we say anything, any descriptor for doctor, lawyer, whatever, we use the pronoun he. I mean, these are the old habits which we're trying to undo now. So my way of doing it, this is 25 years ago, but my way of doing it was to alternate the pronouns male and female in every paragraph. Now that is no longer sufficient. And it was very difficult doing this 25th anniversary edition to address that. And I just don't feel equipped or deeply knowledgeable enough, or enough of a pioneer maybe, to figure out how to deal with the pronouns. So I left it as it was, alternating he and she, although that's not really adequate anymore. So there's more work to be done, and that's for the 50th anniversary edition maybe.
Hey, I'm looking forward to that one and being
Yeah.
there for it.
Yeah. So just to wind up, you've had your final ordeal, and it is a big climax and a purification in the story, redemption for everything that the hero has maybe done wrongly in the past. But finally, it's resolved. And then there is a kind of a coda in most stories where we wrap things up, and that's stage 12, which I take here directly from Campbell, the term return with the elixir. And elixir is a word from Arabic that means a magic powder, magic potion, which has the ability to heal all wounds. It's like the word we have in counter to pandemic, we have a word panacea, which means the thing that heals everything. And so passing through an ordeal like this, facing your fears, surviving it, incorporating all those things lead to a wonderful gift which is given to you, or which you take possession of. And that is some newer understanding, some better view of yourself and the world you live in, some better sense of what's possible for you, and also a sense that the hero's taking responsibility. That's very important. Really deeply understanding these things, that it's not just swashbuckling, it's not just heroes in capes, it's a much deeper thing about taking responsibility for who you are and how you're going to treat people and yourself as you go forward. So the last bit is that return and sort of drawing a moral from the story. What was it all about? And having something to take away. So often movies will end with an image that sends the audience out the theater doors with something to think about, some final picture or scene that kind of encapsulates where what all we've gone through, and kind of indicates where it's going next. And the energy of this should be radiant. It should radiate out from the hero's individual experience, and that should make change in the hero's life, but that change should spread out, and it should affect everybody around on the team, everybody in the society, and eventually the whole world. So I have a deep belief that these things, which could be dismissed as silly little story things, cotton candy for the mind, it's not. It is rocket science. It is brain surgery. Literally, people use those terms to diminish storytelling. That it ain't, that you'd hear that in the studio, that it ain't brain surgery, But I disagree. It really is. You're really getting into people and inviting them to appreciate this possibility of change.
Now, I want to make it clear to my listeners that Chris has just given you a tiny, tiny, tiny part of a thumbnail of what this is all about. And the book is about 350 pages or more just on the hero's journey and heroes in these stages. Now, the book goes into other things too that are really cool. And I want to spend the last couple of minutes of this interview, and I really hope because I have 3 pages of questions, and I got up to the first half of the first page. So I'm really hoping we can do another session very soon to pick up. So so the question that I'm going to leave things with, because we only have a couple of minutes left, is since your first edition, what have you learned? How has your approach to this changed? And you haven't even touched on the archetypes. So, but
that's right. That's another tale. I think the main thing is that I've just gone deeper on this business of the physical reactions in the body, the physiological things which we talked about. how certain scenes or types of scenes in movies trigger, to me, delicious feeling, or pieces of music can trigger this really delightful sensation. It comes in many forms. There's some people talk about tickling in the scalp, and I feel something like little pebbles are running down my spine. It really feels like going down my spine, sort of tickling. And it's just an infallible indicator that there's a beautiful design before me, that it links up with something in me. And I put this together for a new chapter in the book on the chakras, on this ancient system basically from India, that puts forward the idea there are spiritual centers up and down the spine, and that those are activated at different times in our development, and can be sort of opened up or turned on as energy centers by wonderful experiences or challenging experiences, by music, by drama, by color, by dance, all these flowers, colors, and things in nature, rainbows and so forth. All those can trigger reactions which you feel. And I noticed when I worked for the studios, I was often called upon to report, mostly on paper, but sometimes they wanted a face-to-face reaction to a script. And other people were responding in a numerical way. They would say, I think it appeals to the male demographic between 18 and 35, and we'll get 45% of the audience with this. And I went a completely different way, and I just pointed to different parts of my body and said, it got me here, it got me there. And I realized I was pointing to these chakras. So I sort of turned the whole thing around and started talking a few years ago in a lecture segment that I called "It's All About the Vibes, Man," because we used to talk in the early days of my hippie youth. We used to talk about vibrations, and everything was vibrations. And wow, did you feel the vibes in that room?
I got one more question. We're running out of time. Doug Rushkoff, who is one of the cyber gurus, wrote a book called Present Shock. And he described in it how the nature of story has changed from linear, like the Aristotelian Ars Poetica, to one that's based on the world. And he used as an example Game of Thrones. Now, I know you've talked about Game of Thrones and how, you get surprised. Like the guy who you think is going to be the hero throughout the whole thing, he gets killed after the first one or two seasons. What do you think about that? I mean, and if you look at video games, that is the way they function. You're going from one world to another world. I mean, how does that fit in with the hero's journey and where that and all of that?
Well, I am very interested in that, and I want to follow that reference up because it is now understood that this is a major part of being a storyteller, being a filmmaker, being a TV series producer, is that you are essentially a world builder, and then you put people in and you make stories within that universe. But that's nothing new, because the whole world of ancient mythology was an incredibly complex network. If you just stick one finger into the pulsing heart of any myth, you just take a name, Oedipus, you will find that it trails off and connects to everything else in this enormous.
Well, that makes me think it's systems theory. We've got to wrap, and I sure hope I can persuade you to come back on for another session, really soon.
Yes.
All right, good. So my guest for the show has been Chris Vogler. He's a screenwriter, story analyst, actor, consultant, including working on Disney's movie The Lion King, and he's the author of the best-selling book, the 25th edition of The Writer's Journey. Chris, it's been great having you on the show, and your website is chrisvogler.wordpress.com.
That's right. That'll get you there.
Thank you so much, Chris.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Rob.